1924, Chicago. In the suburb of Cicero, Joseph Klenner, the town's mayor, addresses a crowd of reporters. Behind him stands the man who secured his election, mobster Alphonse Capone.
Al Capone realized that part of the secret to power was to control local governments, which he did by bribing officials. He controlled a local mayor, Joseph Klenner, whom he considered his guy, who was duty-bound to obey his orders.
But Capone isn't happy. The mayor has gone off message and unexpectedly speaks out against illegal speakeasies, which are the foundation of Capone's criminal empire. Capone isn't going to allow such public disrespect.
So he and the mayor were standing on the steps of City Hall, and they had some kind of argument, so Al just whipped out the blackjack.
He literally kicked the mayor down the steps to show publicly this is what happens to people, even politicians, who defy Al Capone.
Other mob bosses would put the mayor straight behind closed doors. But not Al Capone. In this part of Chicago, he fears no one. What kind of man can beat up the mayor directly in front of the cops and get away with it? Capone's rise to power in Chicago begins in the years of Prohibition. In 1919, the US government outlaws the sale of booze. Selling beer or whiskey is now a crime. Cue the arrival of a young New York hood called Al Capone. The young heavy has come to work for gang boss Johnny Torrio. Torrio's building a successful business, bootlegging booze and illegally supplying it to the people of Chicago. Torrio is one of many gangsters across the US turning a fortune by making sure the good times continue to roll. Torrio's illegal speakeasies serve his imported booze to thirsty Chicagoans across the south of the city.
Prohibition was a complete failure in big cities like New York and Chicago. And Chicago already had a reputation for having a corrupt government and a thriving underworld, even before Prohibition.
And Chicago finds itself well placed for this unintended criminal opportunity.
Chicago became the quintessential Prohibition city because of its location. It was close to Canada, just across Lake Michigan. That meant that booze could freely come into the city as an entry point.
Gangsters like Torrio quickly learn that there's big money in turning the smuggling and selling of booze into a slick business. Torrio's Chicago outfit becomes one of the biggest in the city, and the rapid growth means Torrio's always on the lookout for fresh talent. Enter Alphonse Capone, and the young man's ruthlessness and business sharps see him rapidly rise through the ranks.
He quickly identified Al Capone as a promising up-and-comer and a protege, and gradually let Al Capone have more and more responsibility.
But Torrio's success makes him a prime target for rival gangs. One night, Johnny Torrio is ambushed. He is shot repeatedly in the neck and groin. His attacker is one of his underworld business rivals, notorious gangster and bootlegger George Bugs Moran. Bugs aims the gun at Johnny's head, but as Torrio waits for the coup de grace, Bugs' gun misfires. He's out of bullets. Moran leaves Torrio to bleed out. Miraculously, Torrio survives, but the attack affects him deeply.
Johnny Torrio is almost murdered in front of his own apartment, and he decides enough is enough.
Torrio's sure Chicago is no longer safe, so he makes a life-changing decision for him and for Capone.
While Torrio is recovering from his gunshot wounds, he turns everything over to Al Capone, his former protege. And Capone, of course, is delighted by this.
Torrio leaves behind one of the biggest bootlegging syndicates in America and hands the whole Chicago outfit to Al Capone. At only 26 years old, Capone is now one of the youngest mob bosses in America, worth millions of dollars. And he moves quickly to put his own stamp on the Chicago underworld.
Capone is a very ruthless individual, a very violent individual. He came from a very poor background, realized very quickly that, the only way to get to the top was through, violence.
Capone clears the path to profit by bribing police, intimidating politicians, and threatening his rivals. Capone is soon outpacing his contemporaries in the other great prohibition city, New York. Young gangsters like Meyer Lansky and Frank Costello. In fact, the only mobster who can keep pace with him is one savvy individual, a bright young man who will go on to become one of the most important names in U.S. gangster history, Lucky Luciano.
The two great contemporaries was Al Capone in Chicago and Charles Lucky Luciano in New York.
Lucky Luciano was a rising lieutenant in one of the big New York gangs, but he approaches business in a very different way to Capone.
There was an immense difference between them. Luciano did not look for the spotlight. He wasn't interested in attention. He knew secrecy was his best safeguard.
While Capone's success is built on fear and intimidation, Luciano believes violence inevitably leads to conflict.
His cardinal object was to be no wars between the families.
Attacking your rivals in the streets brought double trouble. Revenge attacks and unwanted police attention. If only the mobs could work together, they could make far more money without attracting the cops.
He wanted no hits and no headlines. If there was bloodshed, the body shouldn't be found. All he wanted was everyone should share the wealth.
But Luciano's way doesn't suit Capone. He doesn't want to work with the others. He just wants Chicago all to himself. And the man who stands between Capone and being king of the Chicago underworld is George Bugs Moran, the mobster who runs the north side of the city.
He thought he had to eliminate the Bugs Moran gang so he could be, if you want to call it, the boss of bosses. No competition in Chicago.
Capone and Moran are heading down the road to a brutal war.
The two of them became rivals for a criminal empire. Only one of them could possibly survive what was essentially a fight to the death.
Capone's gang launch a series of violent attacks on Moran's network.
Gentlemen,
And Moran hits back. Chicago has never seen violence like it. The press go into overdrive, calling the bloody conflict Chicago's beer war. Capone's on the way to becoming America's first ever celebrity gangster. Capone was never going to be an elusive mob boss working in the shadows. He makes the 5-star Metropole Hotel in the center of Chicago his new HQ. Capone takes over an entire floor, with hookers regularly visiting.
The Metropole became a kind of unofficial city hall in Chicago. Everybody knew where they could find him, or somebody who knew him. He was accessible. That was very unusual for a gangster. And he loved to see and be seen wherever he went. And he wore very conspicuous clothes. His suits were kind of an electric blue or electric purple. So he was a peacock, and he loved to show off.
Capone bribes local lawmakers, so he's free to flaunt his position in public without fear of arrest. He wants people to know the face of Al Capone.
Capone loves his notoriety, that he loves being seen as the bad guy. And he sort of plays this up, that, you know, the way he looks, the way he dresses, the way he acts, he's almost like a Hollywood imitation of a gangster in many ways.
He was a huge personality. He would go into a nightclub, he would go into a restaurant, and he would have to sit in the center of the room so that everybody would know that he was there.
But while Capone enjoys the limelight in Chicago, his headlines are causing serious alarm in New York.
Rivals like Lucky Luciano were appalled by this behavior because they felt Capone was just attracting attention to their illicit activities. They wish he would just stop and go away and let them continue without benefit of all this attention.
Luciano and other wannabe bosses aren't interested in showing off. They want to keep their mob business strictly out of sight of the public. Luciano's dislike of publicity comes from his years as a young mobster working for one of the greatest racketeers of his era, a man called Arnold Rothstein.
In New York, Arnold Rothstein was essentially the founder of Organized Crime, Inc. Numero uno, number one, the big man, the big bankroll, the guy who puts everything together.
Luciano had seen how Rothstein had run some of the biggest bootlegging operations in the early years of Prohibition. And he had done it by strictly staying in the shadows. Rothstein had even taught Luciano how to fit into mainstream society, how to present himself as a businessman and not appear to be a gangster showing off. Luciano had learned from Rothstein that for mob business to flourish, it must remain out of the public eye. And as he and other gangsters in New York make their plans in secret to expand the mob, they wish that Capone would just disappear from the headlines. But Chicago isn't going to go away. And Capone's war with Moran is about to spiral out of control. On September the 20th, 1926, Al Capone is eating at a favorite haunt at the Hawthorne Hotel on the outskirts of Chicago. As usual, Capone isn't hiding. He likes to be seen. And his arch-rival, Bugs Moran, has been watching him very closely indeed.
They sent carloads of gunmen out there to blast Capone.
The gunmen open fire indiscriminately. His bodyguard, Frank Rio, flings Capone to the floor to protect him. Thousands of bullets are unleashed in a matter of minutes.
Bullets and glass went flying, and Capone realized how vulnerable he was.
Remarkably, Capone survives. And now he has one thing on his mind: revenge. And the Chicago Beer War is about to make headlines across the US.
Capone's philosophy was kill and then worry about the consequences.
It was a war zone. They didn't use the word terrorism, but gangsters were certainly terrorizing the city, and it was seen as a national crisis.
The war rages on until 1929, when Capone decides to end it once and for all. When Bugs Moran gets an anonymous tip-off to buy a stolen load of Capone's bootlegged whiskey, he thinks it's the perfect opportunity to get the upper hand on his arch-rival. Moran tells his crew they'll do the deal at their secret garage on February the 14th, St. Valentine's Day. Moran's gang wait patiently for the load to arrive. But before the shipment comes in, Bug's crew get an unexpected visit from the cops. It looks like someone has ratted on the deal. Moran's gang aren't too worried. They can usually buy the cops' silence with a bribe or two. But not these cops. They aren't law enforcers. They're Capone's cold-blooded killers.
He had one of his chief assassins put together a plan to eliminate as many of the Bugs Moran gang members as possible. The assassins pretended to be policemen, had the gangsters line up against the wall, pretending to frisk them.
Moran's men realize too late this isn't a raid, it's a hit.
Capone decided to stage a massacre, but he didn't want to do it himself. He wasn't going to stand there with a machine gun and spatter people with bullets. He was much more likely to hire dangerous gunmen to assassinate somebody than to do it himself.
In a matter of seconds, Moran's squad lie dead on the floor. Photographs of the shocking scene spread across the nation. And the bloodbath is known forever as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. To make sure that no one can pin the killings on him, Capone sits a long way away in the company of an attorney. But he knows that he will be the beneficiary. With Moran out of the way, Chicago is his.
If Moran is dead, Capone realizes he's won, that he has sole control of the rackets in Chicago, and he's the top dog there, and it means that he's immensely wealthy. In today's dollars, he would be a billionaire.
But Moran, wasn't among the 7 corpses lying on the garage floor. He never made it to the scene of the shooting. When he saw the cop car outside, he kept driving. Capone's arch-enemy is still alive. While Capone is publicly battling with Moran for supremacy of Chicago, behind the scenes, up-and-coming mobster Lucky Luciano is plotting to make his own power play for New York. His vision is to end the violent infighting and ease the pressure from law enforcement. It's a revolution in the criminal underworld. With Capone's massacre still fresh in the headlines, Luciano and other New York mobsters plan a conference in Atlantic City.
A lot of what they wanted to talk about at the Atlantic City conference is how do we do this in a matter where not everybody ends up dead? How do we do this in a way that doesn't draw the attention from the authorities?
The obvious move is to get violence off the streets and to run the mob as a professional business. The approach couldn't suit Capone less. So Luciano and the others take the bull by the horns and invite the hot-headed Chicago killer to the Atlantic City conference to sit down and thrash it out.
Other gangsters, either in Chicago or in New York City, they were a little wary of him because they did regard him as a bit of a loose cannon, and they really didn't like his publicity-seeking personality.
Fresh in everyone's mind is the St. Valentine's Day massacre. Capone may love to seek out the limelight, but Luciano and the other mobsters predict severe consequences.
It was very rational for racketeers. As much as people think that they're these big tough guys who are afraid of nothing, they're very afraid of the government. And the last thing they want is to bring down the full force of the United States government on them.
Luciano, with the other gangsters, asks Capone to change his ways. But Capone takes issue with his competitors telling him how to run his business. And he storms out. It soon becomes clear that Capone should have listened to Luciano. Just as Luciano warned, Capone's wild killings soon come to the attention of the most important man in America.
There was a new president, Herbert Hoover, and his first thing was he was confronted by headlines from coast to coast about this massacre and about these outrageous activities in Chicago.
Hoover launches a special task force with one mission: get Capone.
The St. Valentine's Day Massacre marked a turning point and the beginning of a concerted federal effort to get Capone, i.e. get him behind bars some way.
Luciano and other gangsters try to put out the public firestorm that Capone has started. They meet with journalists and tell them Capone's Chicago outfit will be disbanded. The story is just a ruse to diffuse the heat. But Capone knows the story is also a message. The other families are running out of patience. With both the US government and the mob on his case, it looks like it's time for Capone to lie low. Capone's next move takes everyone by surprise. He finds safety in the one place no one would expect him to go. He bribes police officers to get him sent to a corrupt jail in Philadelphia, where he finds conditions far from typical.
His stay in the Philadelphia penitentiary was more like a stay in a hotel or a rest cure. People waited on him hand and foot there. Everybody was corrupted, and he had a very easy time there. It was relaxing.
The prison term is in fact part of a deal brokered with Luciano and other mobsters. And Capone is living the high life at the expense of the US government. But back in Chicago, the feds have got different plans for Al Capone. Newsreel across the nation shows elite teams of Prohibition agents aggressively targeting Capone's empire of booze. The squad has been handpicked by the young and handsome Elliot Ness. Nicknamed the Untouchables, it's soon clear that Capone can't buy them off.
The agents who were sent to Chicago to get Capone weren't bribable. They were paid by the federal government, and they had a different allegiance, a different loyalty. They weren't locals, and this made a big difference.
Ness and his squad use wiretaps to find out where the illegal booze is kept, and then raid the warehouses. Ness turns Capone's love of publicity against him. He tips off newspaper reporters who show the world that even Al Capone isn't above the law. Meanwhile, the Treasury Department scrutinized Capone's financial affairs. Back in his Philadelphia cell, the man who craves publicity is getting plenty. But it isn't the kind he's used to. After 10 months behind bars, Big Al gets secretly let out of prison by officials and heads back to Chicago. When he returns, he finds the government have dragged his reputation through the mud. And Al Capone is no longer the king of Chicago. He's now public enemy number one. The obvious move for Capone would be to lie low, but he can't resist publicity. So Capone decides to organize a charm offensive.
He's a publicity hound. He loves, being in the spotlight. He loves seeing his picture in the newspaper. No publicity is bad publicity.
Capone counters the government's campaign and appeals directly to the people of Chicago.
Capone decided to improve his public image by opening a soup kitchen. Many of the working men who were his people were out of work, so he wanted to play the Robin Hood figure. But not only that, he wanted newsreel cameras to come and see him feeding the working people.
Capone says the real crooks weren't hustlers like him, but stock market speculators. But the story is always Al Capone.
Capone was a narcissist to the extent that he had a distorted impression of reality. So he saw himself as the center of almost anything that was going on, and he felt that he was a force for good in the world.
Capone may think he's a good guy, but the US government could hardly disagree more. Working diligently behind the scenes, federal agents have been building a strong case for tax evasion.
Capone was immensely rich. In today's money, he was worth billions, and he didn't pay his taxes.
The police smash open Capone's private safe.
He liked to keep records of what was coming to him to make sure he wasn't being cheated. So finally they had the goods on him.
Facing trial on income tax evasion, Al Capone finds an aroused government ready to put him behind bars.
Capone's indictment hits the headlines. But the charges don't bother Capone. His accountants can strike a deal.
When he found out he was under investigation by federal auditors, He wanted to cop a plea, make a plea bargain, admit that he had not paid taxes for several years.
He offered the United States government $1 million to take care of his back taxes, but they wouldn't take that.
Even when he's brought to trial, Capone is confident that he can walk away. The King of Chicago has a surefire way to beat the rap.
It seemed like he was going to have another brush with the law. He didn't pay his taxes, who would have expected that he would? And then he would eventually get off scot-free and bribe the jurors if necessary, which is what he did.
At the trial, Capone's men open the checkbooks. They pay off members of the jury. It's a classic mob tactic that has worked before, but not this time. At the last moment, the judge shows that the law is one step ahead.
The authorities realized that he probably would try to bribe the jurors or threaten them in some way so they wouldn't convict him. So they brought in, to everybody's surprise at the last minute, another jury who couldn't have been tampered with.
Capone couldn't be outfought, but he had been outthought. He gets an 11-year conviction for tax evasion.
Nobody got 11 years for income tax violation. That kind of case would have resulted in 18 months or something. But they gave him 11 years.
He was stunned. His lawyers were stunned. Everybody was stunned. It didn't seem possible that one could be jailed for such a, quote, minor offense. Of course, the government wanted to make an example of Capone.
Al Capone, the man who once publicly beat a mayor, now finds himself publicly humiliated by the law. And things will go from bad to worse for Capone, as he discovers that prison life isn't so easy when everyone knows your face. On October 24th, 1931, Al Capone, one of the best-known mobsters in the world, goes to jail for tax evasion.
They didn't get him for any of his gunplay, for any of his murders, for any of his racketeering. They got him on income tax evasion, something he had never anticipated.
Capone's downfall makes the news across the world. It looks like the US government has dealt a mortal blow to organized crime. But in fact, Capone has provided gangsters like Lucky Luciano with a smokescreen. Beyond the glare of publicity, a new, secretive, and highly effective organization of mobsters is taking shape. And they're happy that Capone is locked away.
Other gangsters rejoiced that Capone was now no longer at large. On the other hand, they were afraid that the same thing could happen to them. Gangsters learned to avoid publicity from Capone because they saw where it got him. They realized it made him a target for federal investigations that eventually put him in jail.
Outside, Lucky Luciano will make sure that the negative publicity of gangland violence will never again damage their business. When Luciano makes his play for control of the New York mob, he does it not by ordering a public massacre, but with just 2 strategic hits. First, he sacrifices his own godfather, Joe Masseria. And next, Masseria's arch-rival, Salvatore Barazzano. Luciano is now the most powerful mobster in New York. Soon he will lead the Commission, the mob's board of directors, and usher in a new era of cooperation and wealth for what will become the American Mafia. Where Capone failed in his Valentine's Day massacre, Lucky Luciano takes everything with just 2 deaths. Behind bars, his empire gone, Capone's reputation is in tatters. Now the government decide to use Capone for some publicity of their own. They move America's most high-profile gangster to the New Island fortress of Alcatraz.
President Hoover said to the warden, "If you want the world to know what a horrible place Alcatraz is, transfer Al Capone out there." And that is exactly what they did. He was in a 6-foot by 10-foot cell. And they put him on the outside where he could look across the bay at San Francisco. For people to come to visit him, they had to get on a ferry boat and go across the water.
No longer the feared man he once was. For the first time in his life, Capone tries to keep a low profile.
When Al Capone was in Alcatraz, it was humiliating in part because other prisoners were not afraid of him. He was given a very derogatory term, the wop with the mop, because he was often seen mopping.
Capone learns that his reputation is now a magnet for criminals wanting to make a name. One is Jimmy Lucas, a member of a gang called the Texas Cowboys. Capone's fall from grace is complete. His life in the spotlight is bearing bitter harvest. In time, prison doctors discover that perhaps Capone wasn't entirely to blame for his reckless behavior.
Al Capone suffered from syphilis. He acquired it from prostitutes as a young man in Brooklyn, didn't realize that he had it, and it explains a lot about his behavior and his temperamental outbursts throughout his life. As he got older, it also shattered his health because there was no cure for it at the time.
In 1939, Capone is released from prison on medical advice. By now, the syphilis had spread to his brain, and Al Capone has the mental age of a 12-year-old.
The family had a big party for him in Chicago when he got released. And my mother said that Al was there, but he would come up to her and say, "Who are you?" And then he would go over to his own sister and say, "Who are you?"
Al Capone will live out the rest of his life in seclusion in his mansion in Florida. A gangster without a gang. On January the 18th, 1947, shortly after celebrating his 48th birthday, Al Capone suffers a massive stroke and slips into a coma. At almost the exact same time, some of the biggest mob bosses in the US meet in Havana, Cuba. They plan the future of the mob. A future without Al Capone. Instead, it will be led by Lucky Luciano.
He wanted the American Mafia to be a mirror of American capitalism, to cash in on anything that worked with capitalism. And he wasn't going to be restricted. This was a new era, and he was going to modernize the mob. And that is exactly what he did.
A few days after his stroke, Capone dies. The era of celebrity mobster is over, and a new generation of gangsters is born. Now mobsters will work together to create a secret society that dominate crime for generations. They call it our thing, La Cosa Nostra. The world will know it by another name, the American Mafia. The foundations for this organization were laid by Al Capone. But his contribution wasn't through inspiration. It was his brutal and public mistakes that had taught the mob how not to behave. His career may have ended in disaster, but to this day, Al Capone defiantly remains the most famous name in mob history. Public enemy number one.